In the last video, I had mentioned the idea of cooperation in the Arctic. The idea that even when we're crossing political divides, we cooperate with each other because we're living and working in a particularly dangerous environment. In the last years, this narrative has been challenged quite a lot, especially by people from outside the Arctic. The narrative has been challenged insofar as there's much more talk about a potential conflict in the Arctic, a race for Arctic resources, a race for North Pole. These ideas have been informed often by misunderstandings about the nature of the Arctic and about the different rights of the countries which are located in the Arctic. For example, when we talk about an increasing militarization in parts of the Arctic, we have to see that large parts of this are due to the role of, for example, national coast guards in securing Arctic waters in the context of an increase in maritime traffic in the region. Don't forget that Arctic land territory is under the full sovereignty of the Arctic countries, so that Siberia is as much a part of Russia as, let's say, Paris is a part of France, or Alaska is a part of the US, or Nunavut is a part of Canada. Nunavut in Canada and Greenland is part of Denmark. They have a special status, there's a significant degree of autonomy, but the principle is, of course, that we have territorial sovereignty of the Arctic states in these regions. There's the fear often that the future of the Arctic might be one more of conflict than cooperation. And in the spring of last year, the meeting of the Arctic Council here in Rovaniemi was also not as successful as it had been in the past, and there have been differences. There are differences. We have different ideas about climate change, for example. Climate change is a fundamental reality here in the Arctic, but there are people, including decision makers, who have a different perspective which is not in line with the scientific consensus on climate change. Nevertheless, the risk of an actual armed conflict in the Arctic is relatively limited. Why is that? Why is the conflict in the Arctic unlikely? How do we make decisions? A lot of the decisions made for the Arctic are made far away, but often decision makers involve local communities. We have in the Arctic a strong focus on an international legal order, an international order based on rules. This is something which is also accepted by countries which otherwise might not be so much invested in a legal order, in international law, which might not be exactly known for respecting international law. So even countries might have legal differences, political differences elsewhere. International law remains a very important tool for cooperation in the Arctic. Also, the problems we are dealing with in the Arctic, they are fairly complex. And how do you solve complex problems? You solve them through negotiation. And international law provides a framework to do exactly that. International law is not perfect when it comes to the Arctic, but it is an important tool, and international law provides a forum, basically, for discussions about Arctic governance, including rules on how to solve conflicts in the Arctic. When you think of the international law of the sea, for example, you might have heard of the Lomonosov Ridge. The Lomonosov Ridge is a feature at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, and both Canada and Russia, as well as Greenland with regard to them, they think that this might probably be a continuation of their own continental shelf. At this point, there is no final decision as to the exact status of the Lomonosov Ridge, but there's a procedure. And this procedure was created in 1982 when the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted, which has specific rules on continental shelves on how to make sure that is geographical features are allocated correctly in a legal sense. This relies on the expertise of scientists. This is no longer then a political but a scientific question. But it's a legal framework which makes these decisions possible. Overall, we see practically no territorial conflicts in the Arctic. In last months, you might have seen in the news that there was an increasing interest by the Russian Federation with regard to Svalbard. But overall, the behavior of the Norwegian government in this regard has been basically flawless. The Svalbard Treaty is being upheld, and really there's no reason to complain. There's of course a risk that things will become politicized, but from a legal perspective, from a governance perspective, we don't really have conflicts in the Arctic. There's a notable case that you might still find in textbooks, Tartupaluk. Tartupaluk, also known as Hans Island, is a tiny island between Canada and Greenland. It's a bit unclear who actually owns, who has a legal title to Tartupaluk. Basically, it was ignored when Canada and Denmark, for of Greenland, set the border when they agreed bilaterally on the border between the two countries. And every now and then Canadian forces go there by Danish forces. There's practically zero risk of an armed conflict between the two NATO partners over a tiny island of very limited value. Well, it is a limited value for the governments in Copenhagen and Ottawa. Hans Island or Tartupaluk, it has a value because it has a value for the local community. It has long been used by Inuit for fishing, for example. And my Canadian colleague Michael Byers, in his 2013 book International Law in the Arctic, for example, suggested it might be possible that there is no national sovereignty by either Canada or Denmark over the island. Because when they first made these claims, after they realized they had forgotten the island in their earlier border negotiations, at that time, in the 1970s, you could no longer just extend your territory by claiming an island. The rules for the acquisition of territory had changed. Simple acquisition by conquest was no longer legal under international law in the 1970s. Hence, a case can be made that Tartupaluk is actually under Inuit sovereignty. Now, the Inuit people, they don't have a state of their own. They have autonomy in Greenland and in Nunavut. So the legal question with regard to Hans Island is still open. But this is not something where we would have a risk of conflict. In fact, there is no conflict anymore between Denmark and Canada. Now, more interesting is the question of the legal status of waters of the Arctic Ocean. The central part of the Arctic Ocean is beyond national jurisdiction, beyond the exclusive economic zones. Norway and Russia have settled their boundary dispute in the past. So basically we don't really have maritime claim issues. The big exception is the Northwest Passage. Canada includes basically all the waters between its islands in the north and the mainland as so-called internal waters and claims full sovereignty over them. And it's still a bit controversial whether this is possible or not. After the internal waters, you have up to 12 nautical miles of the territorial sea, followed by the exclusive economic zone, which can be up to 200 nautical miles from the coast. States which have in their exclusive economic zones areas which are on the better part of the year covered by sea ice, they can create specific norms aimed at protecting marine environment there, under Article 234 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This does not solve the problem of the Northwest Passage, but it explains how countries like Canada or the Russian Federation can enact specific legislation, making it a bit more difficult to operate in their exclusive economic zones. But none of these issues is really important enough for anybody to risk any kind of armed conflict. So the risk of armed conflict in the Arctic is very, very low at this time. There is, of course, the theoretical risk, and that's something that we've seen during the Cold War, that a conflict which has its origins elsewhere might be carried into the Arctic. We've seen this during the Cold War, we've seen this during World War II, for example. Overall, however, the risk of conflict, armed conflict in the Arctic is very low, even though we have fundamentally different political views. We have very different also attitudes towards international law, but nevertheless international law is important in the Arctic as a way to ensure living together, cooperating across borders. The Arctic remains a space of international cooperation rather than one of conflict.